They slapped me with a fine for legal hunting on my own property. Said it didn't match the neighborhood image. So I made a quick call, signed some papers, and bought the land where their little hiking trail sits. The next morning, locked gates. No trespassing signs everywhere. Now they're the ones stuck inside, wondering how it all backfired so fast. Out here, the land teaches you how to live, not the other way around. The seasons decide your rhythm. The woods keep their own secrets. And if you listen closely enough, the silence of a still morning tells you more about the world than 1,000 HOA meetings ever could. I didn't buy this land to make noise. I bought it to get away from it. The 30 acres that make up my place aren't flashy. No ornate gates, no luxury cabins, no Wi-Fi boosters hiding in fake tree stumps. Just rolling woods, a couple creeks, a gravel road, and a modest cabin I built with my own hands over 2 long summers. It sits just west of the ridge, with a southern view, so wide you can see the clouds rolling over 5 counties. On crisp mornings, the air carries the scent of cedar and pine like it's bottled straight from nature. In the evenings, the crickets and owls swap stories. This land is quiet, and it's mine. I'm not just a man who owns property. I'm a hunter, not the kind that posts photos for trophies or competes in some social media masculinity contest. No, for me, hunting is tradition, responsibility, a bond passed down like a family recipe or a favorite pocket knife. My father taught me how to track deer when I was 10. My grandfather taught me how to respect the land, how to walk it without taking more than it offered, how to clean my rifle with reverence, how to leave no trail unless necessary. I hunt with permits. I hunt in season. I don't bait, I don't poach, and I don't let anyone else do either on my property. Every tree stand I've built has been cleared with the county. Every shot I take, I can account for. Not just legally, ethically. And for years, that way of life went undisturbed. When I first bought the land, the area was remote enough that I'd only see a neighbor once in a blue moon. Sometimes a mail truck. Sometimes a farmer on the other side of the ridge fixing his wire. There were no associations, no bylaws, and certainly no people knocking on your door telling you what kind of flag you could fly or how many chickens you could have. But slowly, like moss growing up the side of an old oak, change crept in. It started with a new development breaking ground across the eastern boundary. Land that used to be owned by an old logging outfit was sold to a developer who promised a modern mountain community with walking trails, shared gardens, fiber internet, and, of course, an HOA. I didn't think much of it first. My land was separate, surveyed, legally marked, and recorded. The nearest edge of their neighborhood sat just past a rocky ravine and thick tree line. Not close enough to matter, not far enough to forget. I figured they'd build their sidewalks, plant their dogwood trees, and live their lives. And for a little while, they did. The first couple of years after the HOA broke ground were quiet. I'd occasionally see new SUVs drive by on the county road. A few of the residents introduced themselves if we crossed paths at the local store, polite, casual, curious about the man who lives off the grid. Some even expressed envy. "I wish I had a place like that," one of them said. No rules, no schedules, just peace. I'd smile and nod. Truth is, it wasn't lawless. It was disciplined, just not by their kind of rules. Out here, the law is the land, and the contract is between you and nature. Sometime during that second fall, I started noticing hikers. At first, it was the occasional solo walker, usually wearing REI from head to toe, politely keeping to the edge of the woods along what used to be a logging trail. Then a couple, then 3 or 4 in a group. Then a Saturday morning string of strollers, water bottles, and dogs on retractable leashes. They weren't coming from the county park or the public trail system. They were walking through my land. And not the front, the side, the narrow strip of shaded ridgeline that runs parallel to what used to be an old utility easement. It wasn't just trespassing. It was assumed access, like they thought this was public land. I wasn't hostile, never raised a gun or yelled. I stopped a couple of them and asked where they were headed. "Oh, we're just taking the trail through the woods," one woman said, motioning toward the HOA. Karen said it was part of the extended community path network. I blinked. "Karen?" I asked. "Yeah," She's the HOA president. Said the path goes all the way around the Easter Bluff. Gorgeous view, by the way. That's when I realized someone had been telling the new neighbors that the trail cutting across my land was theirs. I later found out the trail was originally part of a loosely defined hiking route created by the previous landowner, a reclusive man who allowed a local conservation group to use it informally. No written agreements, no easements, just a handshake and goodwill. And when he passed away and I bought the property outright, I inherited none of that. The handshakes didn't transfer with the deed, and I made no promises. I didn't mind people walking the trail, as long as they knew it was a privilege, not a right. But the moment they started acting like they owned it, that was the first crack in the dam. Still, I gave them space. I put up signs, private land, access by permission only, and no trail access without owner consent. They were ignored. I left laminated notices near the trailhead on the HOA side. Those were torn down. One morning, I found someone had tied pink ribbon around one of my trees with a handwritten note that said, "Please keep trail open. This is a community treasure." That's when I realized I wasn't seen as a landowner anymore. I was being cast as an obstacle, a villain, the guy standing in the way of their yoga scenic Instagram moment. Still, I didn't say anything. Not yet. I kept my hunting seasons clean, my permits current, my shooting times early and respectful. I used subsonic rounds when possible. I avoided weekend mornings to minimize disruption. But no matter how careful I was, the pressure kept building. Little things. Whispered complaints at the local feed store. Karen's long stares when I passed the HOA entrance. A couple residents who used to wave, now looking away. And then, one fall morning, it happened. An envelope appeared in my mailbox, marked HOA notice, infraction cited. Inside was a fine. $250 for unauthorized use of firearms within community vicinity. I sat on my porch holding that letter, the smell of wood smoke in the air, the hills glowing orange with fall. They had crossed the line, fining me for doing something completely legal on my own land. That was more than a misunderstanding. That was a declaration, a challenge, and I was ready to answer it, not with anger, not with fists, but with strategy. Because if they wanted to weaponize rules, they'd better be prepared for what happens when the man they're targeting learns to play the game better than they do. There's a kind of silence that follows a shot in the woods. Not the kind that means danger, but the kind that carries weight. It's part of the land, a part of life out here. A single, echoing reminder that nature still rules the hills, and man only walks its edge with permission. But apparently, in HOA country, silence is sacred unless it's broken by the wrong kind of person. That morning, I'd taken down a mature buck near the creek bed. Clean shot. Ethical kill. I tracked him for 3 days, watching his patterns, waiting for a safe window. I dressed the carcass respectfully and dragged him back by sled to my cabin. By the time the sun had climbed high enough to burn off the frost, I had meat hanging to cool and a kettle whistling. I was halfway through my second cup of coffee when I saw the envelope. Taped, not placed, to my front gate. Bright red text on a white background. HOA citation. Immediate attention required. I unfolded the letter, already knowing the direction it was headed. It has come to our attention that the sound of gunfire originating from your property has caused distress among community members. In accordance with HOA Safety Clause 7.2, residents found engaging in activities deemed dangerous to surrounding neighbors are subject to a fine of $250. Future occurrences may result in escalation. They called it dangerous activity. Not hunting, not discharging a firearm illegally. Just distress. I stood there in disbelief, reading it again, just to be sure I hadn't misread. Clause 7.2? I wasn't a member of the HOA. My property wasn't under their jurisdiction. They had no say over what I did on my land. But they were treating this like some kind of shared bubble, like their paperwork carried more weight than the law. I walked back to my porch, pulled out my county permits, tags, and the game warden's signed notice from preseason. All in order. I took a photo of everything, attached it to an email, and sent it directly to the HOA board address listed on the citation. Subject line: Invalid fine notice. Legal hunting on private property. Message. Attached is proof of hunting legality, along with survey lines confirming my property is not under HOA control. Please revoke this citation and cease further attempts to enforce rules that do not apply. Simple, direct, professional. I figured that would be the end of it. I was wrong. The next day, I received an email reply. Not from secretary, not from general inbox. From Karen herself, the president of the HOA. While we acknowledge your hunting may be technically legal, our responsibility is to the emotional well-being and safety of the community. Several residents reported hearing gunfire within proximity of the trails. Please consider ceasing these activities during daylight hours or on weekends, or further action may be taken. No epalegi. No withdrawal of the fine. Just a request for me to stop being myself, to stop living by the law of the land in favor of emotional well-being. It would have been laughable if it weren't so smug. I wrote back, clarifying that not only was I not bound by HOA policies, but their attempt to fine me, and now their suggestion I alter my legal, regulated behavior, was harassment. Karen didn't respond after that, but she didn't need to, because by the following week, the whispers had begun. I stopped being the neighbor who lived on a ridge. Now I was that guy with the guns. Parents pulled their kids a little closer when I drove by. Runners gave my fence line a wider berth. A woman jogging past my mailbox one morning actually covered her ears when she saw me step outside with binoculars, and I wasn't even holding a rifle. The perception shifted. I was no longer just living next to their HOA. I had become a threat. More notices followed. One citing excessive noise during morning hours. I had used a chainsaw to clear brush. Another warning me about visible carcass handling. Apparently, someone had seen a deer quarter hanging on my game pole and claimed it was disturbing. Karen even tried to file a community disruption report with the county sheriff, which was promptly dismissed because, of course, I hadn't broken any laws. Still, the damage was done. The HOA didn't care if I was legal. They cared that I didn't belong. Then came the final straw. One Sunday morning, I was drinking coffee on the porch when I heard commotion near the trailhead. I walked toward the edge of my eastern ridge, binoculars in hand. There, standing with a group of residents, was Karen, clipboard in hand, animatedly talking and pointing at the trees. At one point, she reached up and tied a fresh ribbon to one of my fence posts. Pink plastic, fluttering in the wind. I climbed down the ridge and met them at the fence line. "Can I help you?" Karen turned, startled, but recovered quickly. "We're marking trail boundaries for safety," she said with a rehearsed smile. "Don't worry, we're staying on the legal side." I stared at the ribbon on my post. "That's my property line." She tilted her head. "Our maps show this as a buffer zone." "Your maps are wrong," I replied calmly. Her smile faltered. "Well, regardless, we have a community plan in place for expanded trail signage and cleanup. We'd appreciate your cooperation." I just nodded. "I'm sure you would." Then I turned, walked back to my cabin, and poured myself another cup of coffee. Because I'd had enough. They wanted cooperation. They get something else entirely. That afternoon, I pulled out the land records I had on file and started making phone calls. See, while my property was adjacent to the HOA, the trail system they used regularly, the same trail they claimed was part of their buffer zone, crossed a separate parcel of land just beyond my eastern fence line. That parcel had once belonged to a conservation group, but due to funding cuts and a lack of formal easements, it was now privately listed for sale. It wasn't large, maybe 12 acres of wooded hillside, but it included the entire section of trail they used for scenic walking, community events, and their annual trail cleanup day. And best of all, it was available, quietly, discreetly, for cash. The next morning, I made an offer. No agents, no signs, no public posting, just a straightforward deal. I'd buy the parcel outright, take over the title, and handle access as I saw fit. The seller accepted. Within a week, the paperwork was done. The trail, the one they fined me to protect, was now mine. And Karen didn't have a clue what was coming. There's a saying my grandfather used to repeat every time someone tried to strong-arm him. You don't win the land by yelling. You win it with ink and patience. Turns out, he was right. I didn't need to raise my voice, slam my fist, or start an argument on the trail. I didn't need to match Karen's energy because I had something she didn't. Proof. And in the world of rural property law, proof beats policy every single time. The trail behind the HOA community had always been a little gray, not legally, but socially. It was beloved, used casually, and assumed to be semi-public. But I'd done my homework years ago when I bought my own land. It turned out the trail didn't belong to the HOA. It was carved through a parcel once owned by a now-defunct conservation group that ran seasonal youth camps and outdoor seminars. After the organization lost funding, the land had passed into private hands. The last record I'd seen had it under the name of a family trust based out of state. They hadn't done anything with the land in years, and with no easement formalized in county records, the trail's use was entirely unofficial. So when the HOA used it, they were walking on borrowed ground. And now that the property was listed, that ground could become mine. I pulled the county GIS parcel map and confirmed the listing. Parcel ID 49-R-232B. Status: active listing, private sale only. No brokers, no website, just a line at the bottom. Serious inquiries only, direct to trustee contact, listed below. I didn't hesitate. I dialed the number that same afternoon. A woman named Margaret picked up. Courteous, efficient, and to the point. She represented the family that held the land and said they'd been looking to offload it before the end of the tax year. I asked her a few simple questions. Had the land ever been legally designated as parkland? Any recorded easements with local entities? Any liens or zoning issues? Her answers were all music to my ears. No formal use. No public right-of-way. Clear title. Open to private sale. Perfect. I offered her full asking price in cash, with one condition. The sale had to remain discreet until the paperwork was finalized. She agreed. We set a meeting with a local title office, and by the end of the week, I'd signed the transfer forms, wired the funds, and walked out with a brand new deed in a sealed manila folder. Just like that, 12 acres of woodland trail were mine. And with it, every trailhead, every bench, every gravel footpath the HOA had once claimed as their own. They didn't just lose a trail. They lost leverage. The next step was all paperwork, but the kind that turns stomachs when delivered. I hired a local land use attorney named Dale, an old-timer who'd specialized in property disputes for decades. He didn't wear a tie, just a pair of dusty boots, a tucked-in flannel, and the smile of someone who knew the value of quiet enforcement. We filed an access revocation notice with the county, a standard legal document that formally declares unauthorized use of private property and nullifies any implied access. We included a copy of the deed, property line surveys, photos of the trail, and HOA signage, a notarized statement confirming there had never been a recorded easement. Dale mailed a certified letter to the HOA board the same day. The envelope was stamped in bold. Cease and desist. Unauthorized use of private property. No drama. No press release. Just a letter, a seal, and the force of law. The next move was signage. I designed it myself, clean, bold, and absolutely unambiguous. Private property, trail closed. No access without written consent. Violators will be prosecuted under state trespass law. Cameras in use, area patrolled. Then, I hired a local fencing crew to install them along the major trailheads. 2 went in near the HOA walking path connection. Another was placed on the old access footbridge where the trail dipped into the ravine. And at the midpoint, where Karen had once tied that pink ribbon to my fence post, I installed a heavy-duty gate and chained it shut. To be clear, I didn't lock people out of nature. I locked them out of entitlement. They had assumed my land, and now their favorite weekend walk required my permission, and I wasn't giving it. I could only imagine the moment Karen opened that certified letter. I like to picture her sitting at her glass desk, sipping something with lemon, expecting another invoice to stamp and file, only to read, line by line, how she and her board had been casually trespassing for years. Dale's letter was simple, but devastating. Your community has no legal right to access this land. Any claims to the contrary are false. You are hereby instructed to remove any trail signage, online mapping, or printed materials suggesting HOA ownership or access. Further contact will be directed through legal channels. Signed, sealed, delivered. With one stroke of a pen, her community trail had been erased. Predictably, they didn't take it well. 2 days later, I got an email from the HOA board's vice president asking if I was open to conversation. The message was flowery, filled with suggestions of compromise and community unity. They offered to partner on maintaining the trail for public use, and even floated a vague offer of compensation. I ignored it. The following week, they tried again, this time more urgently, saying they were willing to collaborate to avoid confusion among residents. I sent back a single reply. The land is closed. The matter is not open for discussion. Please direct any further inquiries to my attorney. Now, don't get me wrong. I wasn't trying to ruin anyone's life. I wasn't out for revenge, just resolution. But resolution doesn't always look like a handshake. Sometimes it looks like a padlock and a no trespassing sign. And sometimes it sounds like silence, the kind that settles over a trail after decades of footsteps finally stop. Within a month, the shift was obvious. The neighborhood message board, which I rarely checked but occasionally heard about, lit up with complaints. Why is the trail blocked? What happened to the hiking path? Why didn't the HOA secure that land years ago? My favorite was from someone who posted, "We got fined for walking near someone's cabin, but didn't own the trail." How does that happen? It happened because they trusted authority over facts. Because they thought a board with clipboards had more power than a landowner with a deed. And now they were paying the price for believing it. The trail remained closed. The sign stayed up. And my land? Quiet. Undisturbed. Respected. The best part? I never raised my voice. Never threatened. Never retaliated. I just waited. I watched them bluff with policies and fines, and then calmly lay down my ace. Ownership. And once you own the ground someone else walks on, you don't need to chase them off. You just need to let them walk into the wall they built for themselves. The first sign went up on a Wednesday. The air was cool and crisp, the kind of morning that usually drew joggers to the trailhead in fleece jackets and neon running shoes. But on this particular morning, the only thing waiting for them was a freshly planted post sunk 2 feet deep and reinforced in concrete. The sign bolted to it read, "Private property, trail closed indefinitely. No trespassing. No public access. Violators will be prosecuted. No fine print. No suggestion of compromise. Just the cold, sharp truth, printed in bold red on white aluminum." And just below that, by order of the property owner, Parcel 49-R-232B. It was the beginning of a shift the HOA never saw coming. I installed 3 more signs at the major entry points. One at the east side trailhead behind the HOA's so-called community garden. One at the switchback bench overlook. And one by the rocky outcropping where I'd once seen a group of teenagers taking selfies with their dogs, never once realizing they were on private land. Each sign was backed with matching notices filed with the county and, just for good measure, emailed directly to the HOA board. No surprises. No excuses. The message was clear. The trail is no longer yours. It never was. The response was immediate and loud. Within 48 hours, the neighborhood forum exploded. Though I didn't have access myself, word got around quickly. A friend of mine, who worked in town but had a cousin on the HOA, told me people were losing their minds. They weren't mad about the trail closing, not at first. They were mad about how it closed. Why didn't we know it was private? Why weren't we informed? Karen said the trail was protected in the HOA charter, but there was no charter clause, no easement, no backup plan, just blind trust in Karen, and now a locked gate standing where their weekend hikes used to begin. Karen tried to do what she always did, send an email. This one was long, carefully worded, and filled with phrases like misunderstanding, ongoing discussions, and working to resolve matters amicably. But it didn't work this time, because the letter I had sent them, signed by my attorney and backed with county documents, had already been posted publicly on the HOA bulletin board by someone else. I hadn't done it. One of their own residents did. Apparently, someone on the board, or close to it, had reached their breaking point. They took my cease and desist notice, complete with diagrams and stamped property records, and pinned it directly under Karen's email in the community forum. The post read, "This isn't a misunderstanding. This is the legal owner taking back what we never had a right to use." It was short, it was brutal, and it went viral, at least within their little cul-de-sac. Karen panicked. A day later, she organized an emergency meeting at the HOA clubhouse and invited concerned residents to attend. I wasn't invited, of course, but I didn't need to be. Someone sent me a recording. She opened with that familiar tone, stern, rehearsed, and dripping with passive authority. "We are in communication with the landowner regarding potential solutions. Our goal is to preserve access while maintaining a spirit of neighborly cooperation." Then someone in the crowd interrupted. A man near the front row stood and said, "Did you ever verify if we had access to that land before you added it to the community trail map?" Silence. Karen looked at her binder, then back up. "I was informed by the developer." But the man cut her off. "That developer sold it 6 years ago. You've been running group hikes on private land without permission. And now, the man you fined for hunting legally just bought the trail and shut it down." Murmurs erupted. No more HOA polish could spin this one. That weekend, I installed the final piece of the puzzle. Trail cameras. They weren't hidden. In fact, I wanted them to be visible, black-cased, infrared motion capture, each one mounted high on a tree with signage underneath. Area monitored. No trespassing. These weren't cheap cameras either. They sent photos straight to my phone. Date, time, temperature, GPS stamp. The point wasn't surveillance. The point was deterrence. You can argue with a fence. You can ignore a sign. But people don't like being recorded, especially when they're in the wrong. By Monday, foot traffic dropped to near zero. The HOA didn't send any more messages. Karen stopped waving when she passed my property on the road. And the trail? The same trail that once echoed with dogs, strollers, and neighbors chatting over podcast earbuds? It sat empty. No one dared set foot on it now. But the public silence didn't match the private fallout. I heard from my friend at the town hardware store that the HOA board was fracturing. Some members were furious. Not at me, but at Karen. Why wasn't the land secured? Why do we find the one person who could shut us down? Why didn't we buy that parcel ourselves when it was for sale? Too late now. The land was off the market. The gate was locked. The lesson was permanent. A few weeks later, I received an envelope in my mailbox. No return address. Inside was a folded piece of printer paper with a handwritten message. "You were right. We should have respected the line. A former trail walker. No name. No apology. Just truth." I folded it carefully, placed it in my desk drawer, and smiled. This wasn't about power. It wasn't about payback. It was about boundaries, the kind that are written in ink, not committee memos. Karen and her board had built their little world on assumed control. They thought if enough people walked a trail, it would become theirs. They thought if they fined me for hunting, I'd back down. That if they wrapped their demands in community language, no one would call them out. But I didn't argue. I didn't protest. I just bought the dirt under their feet and told them to move. The woods are quieter now. Not silent, just quieter. I still hunt when the season rolls around. I still walk the ridge at dusk. And sometimes I stop by the locked trailhead and just listen. No more voices. No more footfalls. Just the wind in the trees and the sound of a neighborhood finally learning what happens when you cross the wrong line. And it happens to be surveyed, recorded, and notarized. By the time the next HOA newsletter came out, Karen's name was nowhere on it. No title. No message from the president. Just a short announcement buried on page 3. Due to personal obligations, Karen Willoughby has stepped down as HOA board president. An interim team has been appointed until the next election cycle. No fanfare. No farewell party. Just a quiet retreat. The kind that happens when a leader loses the room entirely. And based on what I'd heard around town, she didn't just lose the room. She lost the confidence of every neighbor who had once trusted her with their weekends, their votes, and their trail walks. Turns out, the residents weren't angry about losing the trail itself. They were angry about how it happened. One by one, they started asking questions. Was that land ever really part of our community plan? Did the board verify ownership before advertising events? Why were we told we had access when we didn't? At first, the board tried to deflect. They said Karen had inherited the trail tradition from the previous president, that it was an honest oversight, that the developer might have misrepresented the boundaries. But no amount of backpedaling could erase the fact that they'd never owned the land and never had a legal claim to it. And when I bought it, that was the moment the illusion cracked. As for me, I didn't go public. I didn't give interviews, didn't gloat, didn't reply to the handful of HOA members who sent apology-ish emails trying to play both sides. I just went back to my life. The peace returned slowly, like mist lifting from the hills after a long rain. You don't notice it at first, the absence of pressure, of noise, of constant watching eyes. But one day you wake up and realize the land is quiet again. The trail? I'll let it rest. I removed the old gravel markers, pulled up a few decaying benches, and began the process of letting the forest reclaim it. Where sneakers once trampled leaves, saplings now push up through the soil. I planted native shrubs along the outer perimeter and installed fresh boundary markers every 100 yards. And I posted one final sign at the original trailhead, nailed into a post I cut from my own felled cedar. No entry beyond this point. Not out of anger. Out of principle. Because some things, land, rights, respect, don't need to be debated. They just need to be enforced. Hunting season came and went without incident. No complaints. No fines. No flyers in my mailbox. Just the sound of owls at night, the crunch of deer on frostbitten leaves, and the satisfaction of a life that didn't need permission to be lived honestly. Occasionally, I catch a glimpse of a former board member's car slowing as it passed my property. Maybe out of guilt, maybe out of curiosity, but none of them crossed the line again. Not physically, not legally. They learned what Karen never did. Silence is not surrender. Sometimes, it's just the sound of someone setting the trap. I don't brag about what happened. I don't hang that deed on the wall or keep the cease and desist notice framed in my office. But I do keep one thing, folded up in a drawer near the firewood stack. That anonymous note. You were right. We should have respected the line. Every once in a while, I take it out, unfold it, and remind myself that justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just closes a gate and doesn't open it again. That if your HOA thinks a fine will scare you into giving up your rights, just remind them you don't need to argue with bullies. Sometimes you just buy the land they walk on and change the locks. Because real power doesn't scream. It doesn't puff its chest out or hide behind paper-thin policies and title-only authority. Real power reads the deed, checks the boundaries, and lets the fools dig their own hole, right up until the fence goes up around it. I didn't win this with rage or revenge. I won it by knowing what was mine, protecting it legally, and letting those who cross the line feel the weight of their own assumptions. They fined me for hunting on my land, tried to twist community safety into a leash for my freedom. So I bought the very trail they paraded down, and I closed it one post at a time. They thought their rules were the law. But out here, the deed is the law. And the only footsteps I hear now are my own, walking land I own outright, behind gates I don't owe anyone an explanation for. Not anymore.